Hello, good day to one and all. This is Miss A. Krishna Sundar, Assistant Professor, Department of English, KAHM Unity Women's College, Manjeri. So here we are discussing Philip Larkin and one of his most famous poems titled as Church Going. So this is a continuation of the analysis which we have already done. So here we move on with part 4, which includes the last part of the poem, stanza 6 and stanza 7. So before we move into stanza 6, I would like to give you a briefing on what we discussed in the previous stanza, because in the previous stanza, Larkin is giving a reflection about who would be the last people to visit this church. And he comes with a lot of options. He says that maybe some students who are coming to analyze the architectural patterns of the church, or sometimes it could be a ruin collector coming to pick antiques from the church. And the third option can be a great fan of a Christmas property, somebody who comes to see the gowns, organs, etc. Or the fourth option can be someone who is just similar to Larkin, which can be a representative of the poet himself. So such a person can also be an option as who would be the last one to visit the church. So somebody like Larkin can be someone who is not at all religious, but somebody who just gets into a church to know what exactly is happening inside. So this is what he tries to reflect in stanza 5, and here we move on to stanza 6. So this is again a continuation of his reflections and his experiences and his imaginative mind related with how churches are working. So here comes the 6th stanza. He says, bored, uninformed, knowing the ghostly silt dispersed, yet tending to this cross of ground through suburb scrub because it held unsplit so long. So he says the fourth option, some person who's just like the poet himself, who might have come into this church to know, just to know what happens inside. And this person would be a very ordinary person who might be bored, or sometimes an uninformed person. Maybe he's not very religious, and such a person would be coming into this church knowing the ghostly silt dispersed. Now, silt actually means the dirt deposited by a running river. So here Larkin uses the term ghostly silt. So maybe he's bringing the image of a ghost. And this image, again, can give you two different interpretations. Now, Larkin, right from the beginning, is trying to make use of pun by playing with words. So by ghost here, it can mean ghosts coming from the graves, because there usually will be a graveyard which is associated with any church. So maybe he's talking about ghosts coming from these graveyards. Or in another way, it can be the ghost which is related with Holy Trinity in Christianity. So that is another option. But the confusion here is that if you go with the first option, ghosts coming up from the graves, that is something that should stand for disbelief. On the other hand, if you are considering this ghost as one of the members in Holy Trinity in Christianity, that stands for belief. So Larkin is actually playing with words here. So knowing the ghostly silt dispersed, which means this would be a traveler or an irreligious person who is coming to the church knowing that the church is already ruined and abandoned, yet tending to this cross of ground through suburb scrub because it held unsplit so long. So he knows that he is not a religious person. He knows that there is nothing valid going inside the church, but still he is taking all difficulties to get into this church because the church has got some value in itself. Though the church is a deserted place now, the church had some validity in the previous years. the church had held together so many things. You might know that Christians usually meet on Sundays for their Mass in church. And if you look at any Christian church, a Christian church holds a lot of things together. Not just a Christian church, any religious institution, they hold a lot of people together. They hold a lot of ideas together. They bring a lot of experiences together. Imagine a church related to one peculiar congregation. You can see a number of people visiting the church on Sundays, a number of families visiting the church, number of students, number of children visiting these places. And sometimes they come together to attend a wedding. Sometimes they join together for a baptism, sometimes a funeral. So you can see a lot of people from different families, different cultural backgrounds are brought together under one roof, which is a church. So they get a kind of opportunity to share their experiences and share their life, which means whatever comes in their life will become a part of the life of the other people around them, and even the experiences of the other people will become a part of themselves. So it looks somewhat like what Ulysses has told in the poem. Now, Ulysses, the poem by Tennyson, the poem relates with the life of Ulysses, and Ulysses says that his adventurous life has given him a lot of things. He says he has become a part of everything that he has seen, and whatever he has seen is now a part of him. So similarly, a church is a religious institution which can hold a lot of things together. So this traveler, the uninformed, bored traveler who comes to the church, even though he is not happy with the church, even though he is not associating any quality to the church as of now, he realizes that this institution once had a relevance in human society. So at least he is able to understand that the church had held together so many people, so many experiences, and so many lives. But unfortunately, this church is a deserted place. Now, I would like to take you to an abandoned church in Italy. Now, you can see the interiors where everything is in a completely ruined condition. Now, this is actually a church which is in one of the most remote villages in Italy. So, again, you can see even the roof is completely collapsed and you can see the sky peeping through. So, getting back to the poem, so this church once had a relevance, and what was that relevance? And that is what he speaks now. And equally, what sins is found only in separation, marriage and birth and death, and thoughts of these, for which was built the spatial shell? And that's a question mark. So we can see the speaker, or maybe the traveler here, realizes that the church once had its significance. And the significance comes here because of the marriages that happened within the church, the number of baptisms that happened, the number of funerals that happened. Now, if you look at a human life, you can see the three important phases can definitely go like this. It begins with birth, and then an enormous amount of the life is actually occupied within the phase of marriage, and especially during the 1950s, which was totally a different period from today's world when people married at a very early stage. So most of their life, the majority of their life will be contained in within this married relationship. So here, church has actually considered all these things together, like birth, marriage, death, everything happened within these churches. But now, Larkin says this is only found in separation. Maybe he's talking about the increasing number of divorce cases, because in Christianity, divorce was not something which was a very easy thing. It is not a walk in the park, especially in Christianity, to seek for a divorce, but things are changing with the passage of time, and maybe Larkin is relating to that kind of separation which happens right now. So right now churches are almost in a deserted condition. Nobody is visiting a church, and nobody needs a church actually for marriage, The reason is that marriages are not happening. Even if it happens, people are getting separated. And thoughts of these for which was built the special shell. So he's asking a question to the audience. He's asking, was this the real purpose of a church? To contain all these incidents of human lives. Though I have no idea what this accursed frosty barn is worth. So he says accursed frosty barn. Now accursed means something that is robed with or equipped with. And frosty gives you a very stale, stuffy kind of atmosphere. So he calls this church now as a frosty barn. You know what a barn is? You can see a picture there on the left hand side. Now that is a barn, and barn is not something which you see in the same as you can find in the picture in Indian context. And definitely we do have barns, but we have a different concept where in old ancestral homes you can see places where these agricultural products are preserved. So a barn is something like that, and in Western countries this is an area where these agricultural products are preserved. So they are normally separate from the house, but in Indian context, especially in Kerala context, in our ancestral homes, you know that it is not completely separate, it becomes a part of the house. So here he calls this church as a frosty barn. Now, if you go inside a barn, it is not a very good feeling that you would get because it is very stuffy inside, it is very warm, and the smell of these agricultural products will give you a very stale atmosphere. So he says that getting into this church is just like getting into this frosty barn. It is not a pleasant atmosphere. It is not really giving you any kind of warmth or happiness. So Larkin is comparing this church with a barn. And this again makes it very clear that he has got no reverence for this church. But it still pleases me to stand in silence here. So here he says that even though this is a barn which smells very bad, it gives me some kind of a pleasure to remain here and watch and observe this in silence. So in short, he says that he realizes the fact that church could contain everything related to human life. Church, in fact, gave a sense of life and death. Now again, you can see when you talk about death, it can also mean two different things. On one side, if you associate death with Christian teachings, you can see death can be considered as one phase of life because your life never comes to a halt with death, because death is considered as a staircase to heaven. So when you consider it on a religious ground, death is not completely a kind of separation because it only takes you to the next phase. But if you look at it from a realistic point of view, without bringing religion in between, death can mean only separation. So here again, he actually plays with words. So we understand that Larkin is not religious. He is just considering this church as a frosty barn, but even then he understands that these churches had some kind of relevance in society. So the speaker here is still not ready to attach any significance, and that is why he calls the church as a frosty barn. I hope you got the idea. Okay, so now coming to the next stanza. Now this is the last stanza, the very last stanza, and this is a stanza which contains the entire reflection that Larkin had about churches. A serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robbed as destinies. A serious house on serious earth. So Larkin calls this church as a serious house on a serious earth. Now see, he is not calling it as a house. Instead, he is actually looking at the physical construction here, which means he is not attaching any personal significance here. He calls it just as a physical presence, or he considers it just as a physical entity. A serious house, and see, he is not calling it as a home. There is a lot of difference between house and home. A house is just the physical construct. On the other hand, a house becomes a home when people start living there, when there is happiness, when there is warmth, when there is conversation, then it becomes a home. But here, Larkin calls this church only as a house. A serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet. So this is a repetitive point. He uses the term blend. Now this is actually the past participle of blent, B-L-E-N-T now, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet. So by compulsions, Larkin is relating to human desires and drives, because all human desires and drives, they merge together within the church. Remember, the best moments happen within the church, the birth of a child, a marriage, a wedding, and the worst moments like a funeral, a death, that again happens within the roof of this church. So he says that everything that has got some human qualities, those things actually happen within this church. So all our compulsions meet, they are recognized in the sense they really happen, and robed means covered or designed in the name of destinies. So churches, in fact, are able to give some kind of a purpose and structure to human experience. This is what he tries to say when he uses a term, our compulsions meet, or the desires of human life is actually merging with the content of a church. But see the last line, and robed as destinies. Robed as destinies means we can actually consider this as not as destinies, but they are robed in the name of destinies, like they are covered in the name of destinies. Maybe you can interpret it in a different way, where we have to see churches tried imposing their control upon human lives. And you can see that suppose somebody is not visiting the church on a regular basis, it is not seen as a very good culture from their part, because if you are a Christian, you are supposed to visit the church for Sunday Mass. So maybe there is some kind of an indirect kind of imposition or a control that comes from the part of the church, and this is what Larkin might be speaking about. So continuing with the same stanza, and that much never can be obsolete. So obsolete is something which is not in use anymore, which is completely ruined or gone, which has no relevance in today's world. But he says, Larkin here says that at least people will believe that the churches had some kind of a relevance, because most of the desires, human drives, happened within the church. Since someone will forever be surprising, a hunger in himself to be more serious and gravitating with it to this ground. So he says that human desires will never come to an end, which means humans will continue to seek a higher purpose in life, which means that learning, or the way in which we seek knowledge, this will never fade from human hearts. So even if churches are completely abandoned and deserted, there would be at least one person remaining in this earth who would come back to this church, not because he is religious, but maybe because he wants to know more about the relevance of these churches. So he says that such a person will have a hunger in himself to know more about the workings of these churches, and gravitating with it to this ground. So by gravitating here, he's again talking about gravitation is actually the attraction that earth pulls. But here, attraction can be assessed in a different way too, getting attracted to something. So see how Larkin plays with words. So gravitating with it to this ground. So such a person who is actually very much interested to learn more about the workings of these churches, such a person would definitely get into this church completely attracted to this ground, which he once heard was proper to grow wise in, if only that so many dead lie around. So here again he says that maybe that one person who's visiting this church now would have heard from the previous generations that Church is a place which gives you a lot of knowledge. Maybe you grow wiser if you go to church. So maybe he has that kind of a thought, and to get more learning and more knowledge, maybe this person is getting back to the church. And remember, this person is coming not because he is religious, but he is coming because he wants to know more about the workings of this church patterns. If only that so many dead lie around. So now he's taking us back to the graveyard, and if you look at the graveyard within a church, you can see a lot number of dead bodies lying there. Not dead bodies in the real sense, but people who are buried and gone. So you can see a lot of people there, and maybe these people too might have grown wiser going to the church and visiting these church and meeting their compulsions within this church. So he ends the poem on an optimistic note, as you can see. Now, in between, one thing which I wanted to tell you is that Larkin makes use of metonymy here. Now, metonymy means you are relating to just one part instead of talking about the entire thing. For example, if you talk about White House, we know that it directly is related with the President of America. But you are not saying it as the President of America, instead you say the White House. So this is what you call as metonymy, because you are not using the real thing, but you are just using one part of it to give out the significance. So here again, Larkin is actually talking about religion and religious belief or belief systems. But he is not directly relating to it. He uses metonymy in the sense that he is talking about church, the physical construction, people, etc., in order to relate with the religious practices. So ultimately, he ends the poem on a note that churches had an impact in society. Maybe Larkin is not completely willing to accept this as of now, but still he recognizes and understands that churches had an impact. So maybe that is past tense, but still he understands and he is able to recognize at least that fact. So he says churches will not be completely abandoned. Even if it is in such a state, there will be at least one person remaining in this earth who would get back to the church, at least to remember the fact that these churches had a lot of influence in the society, to know that these churches once had a great impact in society. So this is how Larkin ends the poem. Now, when the poem ends, there is still a kind of confusion whether Larkin has got some kind of an optimistic belief related with church, or whether he still remains as a complete atheist. So this is how he ends up the poem. Now, let us just sum up all these points together. Now, if you look at the poem in totality, you can see the speaker is mostly interested in describing the physical features of the church. Though he relates with his reflections, his experiences, he is not talking about the church in a sense about its internal experiences. Moreover, he is furthermore interested in giving a detailed description related to the physical features. Right from the beginning of the poem, you can see he talks about lectern, he talks about books, organ, font, roof, buttress. He says when the church is going to be a museum, the parchment, picks, plates, everything will be actually exhibited. So you can see physical aspects are given more importance here by Larkin. So maybe he wanted to make the audience understand that he is not very much concerned with what happens inside a church. Now again, you can see he calls the church as a shell. He calls the church a barn, a frosty barn. He again says serious house, not a home. So physical reliance is actually highlighted here. So Larkin relates to his disbelief in church, but at the same time you can see there is a rich mixture of Larkin's vocabulary. And if you look at the poem, the very last stanza and the last line, you can see though he is attaching more importance with the physical features, the final outcome is actually philosophical. Now a few more questions for your reflection. Larkin's description of the church, Larkin's reflection on the functions of religion, religion versus superstition, use of irony. You get a lot of ironical statements here. Larkin's use of humor in the poem, right from the beginning, he uses his normal wry humor here. And finally, fears and hopes about the future of the churches. So, with this, we come to the end of this. So, thank you very much for your patient listening. And please do not hesitate to connect with me if you have got any suggestions or any queries based on this. So, thank you once more.